and welcome to the Cambridge Forum discussing of war and law with David Kennedy of Harvard Law School. I'm Philip Hyman, also of Harvard Law School. President Bush has announced a new legal justification for war called preemption to deal with terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. The Geneva Conventions, the closest thing we have to a codified law of how war will be or should be conducted, they are under increasing scrutiny to determine whether they adequately address the conditions of terrorism and the war in Iraq. With Congress, the courts, and the press debating how to apply the Geneva Convention in the treatment of prisoners, vigorously debating it at this very moment, the public may be justified in asking how two such different realms, law and war, can be brought together in a single short volume. In a new essay of War and Law, David Kennedy of Harvard Law School offers a fresh view of the notion of a law of war. Arguing that law, politics, and war have merged in contemporary society, he explains how our understanding of the law of war affects when and how wars are fought. He asked the question, has law rather than morality become the justification for the horrors of war? And if it has, have the benefits of law been adequate to offset the costs and the horrors that are done in the name of lawful war? David Kennedy is the Manly O. Hudson Professor of Law and Director of the European Law Research Center at Harvard Law School. He is the author previously of The Dark Side of Virtue and co-author of the Canon of American Legal Thought. His new essay, Of War and Law, serves as the basis for our discussion tonight. Welcome to the Cambridge Forum, Professor David Kennedy.
Thank you very much. It's truly a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the invitation. I appreciate everyone's coming to participate in the conversation. What I'd like to do before we open it up for general discussion is step back just a little bit from the immediate controversies over Iraq, Guantanamo, detention, and so on, and take a look at the broader opportunities and dangers that have come with new forms of warfare and new kinds of relationships between law and warfare. It's become a commonplace to say that when we think about war today, World War II is no longer the prototype of what we have in mind. We're not talking about wars between great powers relatively equal in size at the center of the world system. War today tends to happen at the periphery of the system among extremely unequal players, often non-state actors. The professionals call it asymmetric warfare. We focus on new warfare technologies when we're thinking about what makes today's wars unique and the technological imbalance between participants on various sides of today's conflicts. When we think about what makes war today unique, our military professionals often focus on the blend between peacemaking and nation building on the one hand and war and occupation on the other. The difficulty of telling in a conflict like Iraq where activities of peacetime and activities of warfare begin and end. The battlefield, in some sense, is no longer as distinct as we imagine it to have been in prior conflicts. And of course, the whole thing happens in the glare of the media. Well, all these things, the media, the asymmetric quality of the warfare, the new technologies, all make warfare today different from warfare in the past. But it's also true that war has increasingly become a legal institution, and it's that dimension of warfare today that I'd like to focus our attention on this evening. Not everybody follows the rules, and not everybody agrees about what the rules are. And we've had a lot of focus in the media recently on the controversies about exactly what the law means and the instances where people have failed to follow the rules or allegedly have failed to follow those rules. But these violations and disagreements shouldn't lead us to underestimate the remarkable extent to which war has nevertheless become a legal institution. If we think about the military today, it's become a very complex bureaucracy, knit into civilian life in all kinds of ways. Local and national rules across a very wide terrain in many countries provide the backdrop on which the military mobilizes troops, mobilizes forces, and brings them to bear in conflict. Managing complex coalitions across many diverse jurisdictions requires agreement at the get-go about the principles and the very technical rules that will guide the activities of various participants in the conflict. If we think about the recent Lebanon conflict and the difficult negotiations at the United Nations that led eventually to the offering of a peacekeeping force there, the negotiations were about the rules of engagement. How robust, how not robust, who could fight when and under what circumstances, what would happen if you saw a weapon being transported across the border, who was entitled to do exactly what in warfare. It's not just a way of holding the coalition together, it's also a way of disciplining one's own force and ensuring that no one soldier triggers a reaction that the commanders have not been expecting. So in all these ways, the inside of warfare, like so many complex bureaucratic activities today, has become legalized. But we're also familiar with the traditional role of law privileging the killing in war. If you kill this way, and you kill here, and you do it like this, and you kill these people but not those people, then you have a privilege. It's not murder, it's a privileged part of legitimate combat. And we're also familiar with the extent to which law has become a vocabulary for judging the legitimacy, not only of war in general, was it really self-defense under the UN Charter, was it authorized in fact by the Security Council, but also the tactics of particular battles. Was that strike proportional? Was it really necessary? Was the damage in fact actually collateral? If we think back to an earlier moment in warfare, it's very hard to imagine Napoleon consulting a lawyer to decide what to target. And it's extremely difficult to imagine that someone would have gotten extremely upset about Hitler's rise to power purely on the basis that what he was doing was illegal. There were lots of bases for outrage, but law was not among those most prominent on people's list. And yet, when it comes to the Iraq conflict, we do find lawyers forward deployed with the troops poring over targets, and we do find people marching in the streets all over the world asserting that the war was illegal and therefore ought not to be regarded as legitimate. At the same time that war has become increasingly a legal institution, however, law has also changed. And it's changed in a number of ways that make the law of war difficult to understand from the outside. First of all, it's no longer a matter of extremely sharp boundaries, or not only a matter of extremely sharp boundaries, between war and peace, separated by a declaration of war, between combatants and non-combatants, between on the battlefield and off the battlefield. In the same way that those places and spaces have become mixed up in the nature of modern conflict, the law has also responded by transforming itself from a series of very detailed rules into broad standards. Was it proportional? Was it necessary? These have become, in a way, code words, but also ethical standards by which all kinds of detailed acts of violence can be judged in wartime. Secondly, humanitarians no longer stand outside of warfare, denouncing it as illegitimate, illegal, and so forth. It's astonishing, actually, the extent to which the lawyers at the Committee of the Red Cross and the lawyers who work in our military bureaucracies share a common vocabulary, work together in a wide variety of ways, and the extent to which the law of war has transformed itself through its interaction with the military to be an extremely user-friendly set of rules. It's, of course, also in the interests of the military that the strike not be proportional, that ammunition not be wasted, that destruction not be wanton, that the troops follow the rules, that the tip of the spear be extremely well disciplined. And the partnership between humanitarians and military lawyers is, on the one hand, something to applaud, but on the other hand, something that can create new difficulties. At the same time, law is no longer standing outside politics, judging politics, the instrument of politics, Here at home, we're familiar with the extent to which our politics has become itself legalized. The number of lawyers in political life is quite astonishing. But the vocabulary of political campaigns, the ways in which candidates attack one another, it's very often legal. What you did was illegal, violating this, violating that. It seems much easier to find that the opposing party violated some small norm someplace than to actually articulate an alternative vision of politics for the country. Finally, we no longer have one law of war, if we ever did. As law has become a far more flexible device of standards like proportionality in an extremely diverse world, we find that there are very sincere disagreements about what the UN Charter actually means, very sincere disagreements about what will count as a proportional or a legitimate strike, and no one to resolve those differences. So you find in warfare today all sides claiming that what they're doing was in some sense legitimated by an interpretation of law. In the recent conflict in Lebanon, both sides are quoting Security Council resolutions. Both sides are asserting that something about the tactics that were used by the other violated very significant principles of the law of warfare. So we have a new form of warfare accompanying a new kind of law. This creates some opportunities, and it also creates some dangers. Opportunities, on the opportunities side, there are strategic opportunities for the military. And they have a term for it, lawfare, they call it, waging war through law, using law as a weapon, finding ways of conditioning the battlefield by explaining that they're actually entitled to kill civilians if they do it in a certain way, using law in a wide variety of ways in combat. If you want to take out or eliminate the access that an enemy might have to a satellite or the images from a satellite in warfare, you might do that using a military weapon, but you might also do it by simply buying up all the commercially available satellite space using contract as your weapon. So an increasing understanding inside the military that law can be a strategic ally in warfare. There are also opportunities for humanitarians seeking to restrict the violence of warfare. When the law in war, the new law in war, works well, and it often does, it provides a vocabulary of communication across very different cultures about what is and is not understood to be legitimate in warfare. So it is quite remarkable to find the same terms and the same common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions used in so many different ways by participants in a dialogue about what one can do in the war on terror, whom one can detain and how they can be treated. Even if there's disagreement about the details and around the edges, it's a remarkable achievement that humanitarians should be quite proud of, that everyone is speaking their language. And finally, there are new opportunities using the law of war to create a heightened sense of responsibility for the violence of warfare, to try to figure out who actually ordered the strike, to trace through the law back to find out exactly what happened. It's very difficult, it turns out, to run a completely black operation. If you're the CIA, you have to send a chartered plane somewhere to pick the person up. Somebody marks the tail number down as part of their routine activity. You had to stay in a hotel. Someone can trace the bill. If an Italian prosecutor suddenly wants to unravel the skein, unraveling the skein of a CIA black operation in the war on terror is not all that different from unraveling the skein of any number of other kinds of complicated bureaucratic activities if you're a prosecutor. So there are a variety of new opportunities opened up by the merger of a new kind of law and a new kind of war, but there are some difficulties too. Everyone in the business focuses on the doctrinal difficulties. It becomes very difficult to know, for example, what weapons you should equip your troops with if they're headed out of the green zone, and in one neighborhood they'll be doing policing, in the next neighborhood they'll be building a school, and in the next neighborhood they'll be engaging in combat. It turns out the weapons that you're allowed to use in domestic riot control and in combat are quite different under the law of war. Well, do you give the person tear gas, for example, which is permissible to use in crowd control when policing, but is not permissible, because it's a form of gas warfare, if what you're doing is engaging in conflict. When these activities blend into one another, there are all kinds of difficult questions of that type that people struggle to try to unravel. But there are also broader dangers that I think we should worry about. I think there's something chilling about humanitarian voices finding themselves applauding the use of law as a vocabulary of legitimacy. We've said often as international lawyers in the last years, international law is very important because it makes what you do legitimate. And if you don't follow international law, your political activity, your military activity is not, in some sense, legitimate. But we need to remember what it means to say that warfare is legitimate. It means to say that the killing, death, suffering, and destruction that go along with warfare is in some sense justified, and that the end of questioning it arises at the moment the law declares it legitimate. Something is lost when humanitarians use legal vocabulary to define the extent of their ethical and moral opposition to the violence of warfare. And something is lost also when military leaders and politicians speak the language of warfare. I remember American Major General James Mattis, when he was poised to invade Fallujah a little over a year ago, gave his final warning to the insurgents who were in Fallujah in these terms. He said, "We will be humanitarian in all that we do. We will fight the enemy in their terrain. God help them when we're through with them." Well, there's something quite chilling about the combination of a stark military threat with a humanitarian promise. There's an incredibly broad threat and deep knowledge and intent to kill and damage the lives and property of hundreds or even thousands of people wrapped up in a promise to be humanitarian in all that we do. I think that's something that should give all of us who are concerned about the violence of warfare pause. And I think there's a way in which this new, and I'll end with this thought, this new vocabulary, common vocabulary for judging warfare that comes from the law can leave all of us having a hard time experiencing responsibility for the violence that happens in warfare. There are many stories of soldiers in Iraq who were overcome with the quite human experience of remorse after having killed somebody, killed a civilian, killed another soldier, and then being counseled back to duty, not just by their commanding officer, but also by their chaplains and by their attorneys, who said what you did was proportionate, what you did was legitimate, what you did was just. I think that something has gone awry when the legal standards are there to dampen that deep human experience of responsibility and ethical jeopardy that comes when one engages in the violence of warfare. But it's not just soldiers in the field, it's also the way in which military leaders can offload responsibility onto politicians. Politicians can offload responsibility back onto their military commanders. And we as citizens can offload our responsibility for participation by accepting all too easily the argument that, well, actually, I guess the damage was collateral. I guess the war really was legitimate. I guess it really was self-defense under the UN Charter. So I think a big purpose for me in writing the book was to try to understand in a more complicated way how law has become an internal vocabulary of the military and what got lost in our sense of ethical responsibility as that happened. So thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
You're listening to David Kennedy discussing of war and law. And as the moderator, I get to ask two questions at the beginning, preferably unkind and probing questions. David, you're an expert in European law. You know, Professor Kennedy teaches the law of the European community. He knows the European law well. I was with a French professor 3 or 4 days ago, and we were discussing the rules for coercive interrogation. And he said torture, cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment. He took me aside and he said, you know, in France, we don't take those rules seriously. We would never think of putting together rules that tried to accurately reflect what we were going to do or not do. We would make obeisance to a prohibition, a taboo of torture and a taboo of bad treatment. And then we would expect our military to do whatever they had to do. Is this is your view too American a view of the role of law? In other words, you're making it sound like everyone in the world takes the law very seriously. Maybe we take it more seriously than anybody else.
I think I would put it this way. Different countries take it seriously in very different ways. So we find also in the European context, the rules taken extremely seriously when their accusations are made that other countries, including the United States, have failed to follow them. And to use as a vocabulary for justifying their own political decisions, the law is extremely convenient. And we find also that a variety of savvy commentators will often say, we don't really take the law seriously, we expect our military to do what they need to. But then when you go and talk to the military people, they say, well, actually, we're a very complicated system here. And when we get out there and our Navy is working with the Australian Navy and we're trying to put it together with the Italian Navy and so forth, the only language we have to communicate with one another through turns out to be rules about what's permitted. So one of the main ways in which the American military has found itself wrapped up in conversations about rules of engagement are when we try to engage in coalition operations with other countries that have who have slightly different ideas about what the rules are. So the Australians have signed up for the Landmine Convention. Well, we want to use their boats to carry our soldiers close to the shore in the Iraq conflict. They're part of the coalition. Can we be carrying mines? We haven't signed up for that convention. If we're on an Australian ship, lawyers have to be called in to sort that out. So I think although in the Capitol there's often a lot of savvy commentary, wink, wink, about what goes on behind the scenes, the thing that's been most surprising to me in doing the research for this book is that when you get into discussions with the professionals themselves, whether they're rules that come from international law or rules that come from their own internal bureaucracy, there's something that is much more ubiquitous than I would have expected. And you know, a funny thing, I went a few years ago to Senegal with the US Naval Justice School to do a training program for the Senegalese military on human rights and the law of warfare. And at that time, the American military was the largest human rights training program in the world, operating in 53 different countries. And the idea for the Senegalese military was you want to use the weapons we sell you, you want to participate in international operations, you want to be part of a UN force in a place like Darfur, then you've got to do it in some sense along the lines that we do it so that we can communicate with you. And of course, the generals from the border areas said, yeah, but shouldn't we just make sure that CNN doesn't come by? The answer always was, you can't be sure. You have to always act as if there's a CNN camera somewhere lurking in the background.
And behind it all is not a fear of American reaction to lawlessness. It's a fear of lawlessness that is broader than American.
I think that's right. I mean, I think the line that we took with the Senegalese military, and I think reflects the thinking in the field, was that a use of force you can proudly stand behind and disclose is ultimately a more effective and stronger one.
For us.
For whoever is doing it. That any military gets in a difficult situation when it finds itself only able to achieve its objectives in ways that can't be disclosed, because ultimately somehow, somewhere they will be disclosed, and someone with power to make it more difficult to achieve those objectives will then have a very strong argument against what you're doing.
Okay, just one last question before I open it to the floor. Wouldn't Vice President Cheney agree with your concern about over-legalization of war? I mean, we're really in a time when the administration has tried very much to create a black hole of no law by declaring people illegal combatants, not somebody that has to be subjected to the criminal laws of any country, and someone who has no protection by the laws of war. So they've been working hard to rid themselves of this lawfulness that you seem to be complaining about.
I think that's a mistake. I think, as an interpretation, Phil, I think that it's been very common for those who oppose the administration's policies to say that what they're doing is creating a legal black hole. Guantanamo is a legal black hole, everything is a legal black hole. And it's true that they're producing and pursuing novel and unique interpretations of the rules. They have a lot of lawyers working on it that in every case strengthen the president's prerogative if those interpretations were accepted. But Guantanamo is hardly a legal black hole. It's one of the most intensely legalized places. It's just not legalized in the same way that one would have expected it to be legalized under the Geneva Conventions. So what I would like to do is step back and ask a different question. Not is the choice between a political discretion and the rule of law, but is the choice between a rule of law that's far more legitimating of violence than we realize and some heightened sense of ethical responsibility. And on that, I'm not sure Shani and I are so much in agreement.
I hope not. You're joining Cambridge Forum as we continue our discussion with David Kennedy of Harvard Law School about his new book of War and Law. Let's take some questions now from the audience. Remember, please, to line up at the microphone. Questions? Good, an icebreaker.
You've talked about how legality has pushed ethicality aside in thinking about war, and laws have all kinds of institutions behind them. What about ethics? What's the right role for ethics? Should it be a voice in the wilderness? Should it be criticizing from outside institutions, or institutionalized? If so, how?
I think the thing that's been most surprising to me is the extent to which those in the public domain who have an interest in raising an ethical voice about war and an ethical objection to warfare have hooked their wagon to legal standards over the last 50 years, 100 years, and have given up on the project of articulating an alternative religious, ethical, human, moral basis for understanding the responsibility that we have for death and destruction and warfare, and the institutions that might normally be expected to stand outside in some way and develop alternative vocabularies have all shared the strategy of the International Commission of the Red Cross of trying to work with the military to pour their ethical ideas into legal standards of just war. What I'd like to do is take a step back from that effort, acknowledge its success, and try to provoke folks who are of good heart and hope to be both within the military and outside the military, and hope to restrain the violence of warfare, to realize the limits of that strategy and the need precisely for institutions to begin to try to articulate opposition to warfare, if that's the goal that they have ethically, on other grounds. But I actually was quite surprised to find how few alternative visions there were out there that had been institutionalized in some way. In a way, it's a similar kind of phenomenon to the way in which the vocabulary of human rights has come to dominate our understanding of human emancipation, as if there were no other ways of thinking in local terms, in different cultural terms, about what social justice might mean in a particular context. And in that sense, we know that social justice isn't the kind of thing you can make once in 1945 and then just follow the rules. It has to be made by people in context over and over again. And I think the same thing is true for understanding the ethical weight that comes with killing in warfare. It's not a problem that can be solved by a codification once and then let to rest and turned over to the professionals. It's the kind of discussion that needs to be woken up for every generation and for every conflict in a new way.
Shortly after 9/11, President Bush announced to the world that he had absolutely no intention of following the Geneva Conventions. Prior to 9/11, he had on his own abrogated the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. To what extent does the President of the United States have to follow the treaties that we have signed in the past? Thank you.
Well, it's certainly true as a matter of the law of the United States that all of our executive agents are bound by the treaties in the same way that they would be bound by a statute of law. I think the interesting thing about the Bush administration's reaction to these legal standards is the extent to which the lawyers who were crafting interpretations of them got a little bit carried away with what they could do with words on a page. Imagining that if they could push and pull the words around in some way, they could actually produce an argument for executive authority that they could persuade their 5 best friends to accept, that was a meaningfully usable bit of legal advice to give the commander-in-chief. And I think as citizens, we were ill-served by those lawyers. I don't think that they gave good advice to the commander-in-chief on those points. In the same way that if one were advising a business client, you wouldn't, and the business client were about to do something, you wouldn't say, absolutely, that's completely fine. I've found a novel and new interpretation of the statute that will allow you to get away with it. Well, you'd also want to tell the client, not everybody's going to see it that way. There are some dangers out there. There are going to be some reactions. So the usefulness of these rules in those kinds of situations is that they provide an opportunity to bring into the discussion some recognition of what other people are thinking and how they'll react to the legitimacy of what we do. And if those are people who have the power to affect the conditions of the battlefield on which we're fighting, and in this kind of conflict they are, they'll be, in a way, bringing to bear some strategic consideration that one would want the commander-in-chief to have taken on board. So I think that the question is not one of ignoring the law or not ignoring the law. The question is how one uses the law. Do you take the opportunity provided by these legal standards to say, well, how can we design a program for detainees that allows them to be gotten in and out of the status? What are we going to do with them after a longer period of time? How do we bring the criminal justice system and the military justice system into some conversation about these people? What's going to happen 6 months down the road? What happens when we pick up the wrong people? How are we going to deal with that? A large number of questions that lawyers in the process of thinking about it might have asked, but seem not to have asked in a way that came up with very productive answers. So I'm more worried about the missed opportunities to design a strategy that would actually be sustainable and to use the law to understand how our allies and how our own citizens would understand what we're doing than I am about a broad tendency to either ignore or set the law aside. I think that the administration would say, and their lawyers would say, that they have found an interpretation that justifies what they're doing. And I think we all need to admit that the legal terms are simply more plastic than we wish that they were. And it's not true, just as a matter of law, that the definition of proportionality or the definition of Article 3 is the only possible one. So that means that we need to build political coalitions and ethical coalitions to continue to make the definition that we would hope they'd have alive in political terms and in the decision-making of the people who are actually going to war.
Just a couple of very quick thoughts that I hope resolve into a question, and that asking myself why American legal theorists and European legal theorists are trying to figure all these things out and are trying to come to apparently some kind of common understanding. And that led me to the thought, well, who are the guys on the other side? Are they part of this dialogue too? Well, people like Al-Qaeda, presumably, in my view anyway, they seem to have no rules. They're willing to do any way whatsoever of killing people, torturing people, causing chaos, etc. And at least in this Western tradition we're talking about, Geneva Conventions outlaw this, this, and this, the Paul McCartney campaign against landmines, et cetera, that presumably, hypothetically, somewhere down the road, one by one will eliminate every single thing until finally it's one world at peace that resolves differences through other means, more peaceful means than warfare. So maybe that provides a rationale why these European theorists are doing this. Maybe this is a good thing. Maybe you're concerned that it does allow levels of violence is not as bad as maybe you're presenting it, because the alternative, I guarantee, you know, if Al-Qaeda could get nuclear weapons, they would use them. If they could get horrific chemical weapons, they would use them with no limits whatsoever, I don't think. So I just wonder if you have a comment on that idea.
Well, first of all, I think the way that we approach our own conduct in warfare ought to be a function of our own values and our own civilization and our own approach to it and our own political and legal culture. So even if it were true that that part of the asymmetry is a complex, legal, bureaucratic, rule of law oriented force facing a completely different kind of force, I don't think that answers the question at all of how we should go about it. But that said, I think the surprising thing about these asymmetric conflicts is the extent to which, even if it's true that they would not be following the rules if they had the chance not to, the extent to which they're using the rules and the vocabulary to have an effect on the legitimacy of what we do and on the perceived legitimacy of what they do is quite extraordinary. So if we bomb someplace and some civilians die, even if it was the most tightly controlled strike with the most precision weapon that had ever been devised, and some civilians die, and of course under the law of war you are entitled to kill civilians, so as long as you're not killing too many of them. We just have to recognize that there is no absolute ban on the killing of civilians. You can't target them, but if they're killed collateral to a legitimate military objective in a proportional strike, it's privileged. So the law is not as unfriendly to civilian death as one might imagine. That said, every time there's one dead civilian, whether it's Hezbollah or Al-Qaeda or whoever, immediately say that's a violation of the law of war. And for many people that resonates. That is, they're fighting in the same media world that we're fighting in. And they also have a constituency, and they also are pursuing a political project. And we need to understand that if your son or your husband was killed by an American strike, there's no way you'll ever understand that that was necessary and proportional. You'll always think, so how powerful America was, did they need to kill my husband? And that will resonate. Now, we may have a perfectly good legal explanation of how that, under all of the rules the way we understand them, that was a legitimate action and that was a privileged killing, but we also need to understand that we're fighting in a terrain in which there are people who interpret the same standards in wildly different ways, and they do use the same language. They do pay attention to the difference between civilian death and non-civilian death, at least when we do it, at least when they're legitimating their own activity. And they have all kinds of arguments about the legitimacy of suicide bombing and so on, and the very tactics that we would think are absolutely heinous, the very definition of perfidy in combat, they have arguments that are using weapons from very far away, sending a missile from the middle of Missouri with a computer to bomb someplace else and so on, are the very definition of perfidy by a force that's vastly superior in technology and so on. And there is no court to resolve that question other than the court of world public opinion. And we're facing different public opinions. So it's that kind of conversation that the law of war, when it works well, can facilitate. When it works poorly, everybody thinks what they're doing is justified, that the other side is terrible, and that warfare is absolutely legitimated. So it can go either way in those situations, and I fear that in the recent conflict, the legalization of the vocabulary has done more to make everybody feel they're entitled to kill, and they're justified in killing, than it has to moderate that tendency through some kind of dialogue. Sir?
Yes. The question has to do with the rights of the detainees at Guantanamo and detainees, the so-called enemy combatants who are taken without uniforms. I did some, when 9/11 happened, or shortly thereafter, I did some thinking about it, and I thought, well, it seemed to me that the precedent, the legal precedents for dealing, for understanding what the rights of such persons might be, would trace back to the laws applying to spies, pirates, and the criminally insane. I recognize what you say, that the law is in a process of evolution and that these precedents have to be reaffirmed over and over again and so forth, and I agree with all of that entirely. But what say you about the rights of these detainees? For example, do you say that they should have the right, I mean, is your understanding of the law or the military law or the international law, which are not the same things, and as well as civil, American law is not the same as military law. I'm under the impression I'm not.
Sure.
Have not been a law student. But do you say that these detainees have the right to view the charges against them and have the right to avoid torture, to evade torture, as it's been defined under the Geneva Convention, despite the fact that they're out of uniform and apparently implicated in this struggle?
So, thank you for the question. It's a good one. I think that if I were a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court and somebody asked me that question, I would be very inclined to rule to maximize the extent to which the people that get caught up in the war machine have, in some sense, the right to be heard and the right to be treated in some decent way that will lead them to have some understanding of how their future can be resolved, and that would help the American government to disentangle itself from the problem of having so many detainees. But I'm not, tragically, a member of the Supreme Court, and so nobody is going to ask me to rule on that question. We're much more in a situation in which we need to recognize as citizens that the categories the current administration has come up with are not all that novel. So it's not a crazy new idea to imagine that there's a category of unprivileged combatants, that is, people who are on the battlefield engaging in combat, but who don't fit the exact form that would allow them to be privileged. They're not wearing a uniform, they're not doing all the things that would lead us to say that the killing they were engaged in was legally privileged, but they're not civilians either. And that category has been around for a very long time. And it's been a constant struggle in the law of war to figure out how those people should be handled. For me, the difficulty with the way we have been handling them is not only a humane one, but it's also a political one, and it's a strategic one. Was it sensible to devise a category that we could put people into but had no way to get them out of? Was it sensible to advertise that we were going to handle a group of people in this war in a way that would lead them with no ability to be heard, no ability to make their case, no ability to have the conditions under which they were originally detained, scrutinized by anyone? Did that look tough, or did it just look irresponsible to the important courts of public opinion that will be necessary for us eventually to prevail? And I think that the lawyers drafting the strategy missed an opportunity to set things up in such a way that not only would have been more just and more humane in my view, for whatever that's worth, but would also have been politically more sustainable and militarily more practical over the long run in a conflict that's bound to produce more and more people of this type over time. So it's a question of how we use the law strategically, for me, more than whether or not it is or is not permitted. It turns out in these complicated interpretive situations, there's no answer machine on whether or not it is or is not permitted. People have different views, and we have to understand that there needs to be a dialogue in the country and in the world about which of those views should prevail in a particular situation.
I'm wondering, the Geneva Conventions were drawn up, as I understand it, internationally by a group of people. Who is the final interpreter and arbiter and enforcer of the Geneva Conventions? And is this, whoever that is that recognized by our country specifically? And are we, in some ways, I don't understand why we're able to say things like, we're going to reinterpret the Geneva Convention, for one thing, because I would think that, is that our right to do that? And secondly, how can we pass laws that will exempt our people from specific violations of the Geneva Convention when other people wouldn't be?
So this is a very good question, and it's about how the whole international legal order works. What is the status of these rules anyway? We're used to imagining that if something is a law, somewhere in the background there's a court and a prosecutor and eventually the Supreme Court, and they'll sort out the answer to the question whether it was legal or not. So who's playing that role for these international legal norms is the question. And the answer is that it's a disaggregated multiple system in which treaties sometimes are enforced because they get internalized into the law of the countries that signed them, and they become part of our law, and they get interpreted by our courts. And so there are many, many treaty standards that have become part of law and are applied to a variety of different kinds of situations by courts all over the United States all the time. Now, of course, when that happens, our courts could come up with a slightly different interpretation of the treaty than the courts in Canada might, or the courts someplace else might, or even different courts in the United States might come up with different interpretations. And there's no international court available to give a final determination. The final determination is, to the extent there is one, happens through the political process by which countries protest one another's interpretation and try to exact costs. So if, and we've seen some of that happening, where a country takes an outlier interpretation and other countries care about it, they begin to exact costs. It's more difficult to get cooperation. It's more difficult to get an ally to sign on. It's harder to get the UN to legitimate what we're doing and come back in. So slowly the political costs rise as our departure from the common view in some way increases. There's nobody to force that other than the way the international political process forces it by making it more difficult for us to succeed in our international projects when we're trying to do that in a way that other people profoundly disagree with. So it's hard to get our minds around a legal system that is enforced through this process of push and pull back and forth, but that's how it works. We interpret the Geneva Conventions in some way, and then our allies either go along with that or they don't. And when they don't, we've paid a price. Other questions?
I have one or two, David, before we quit.
I thought you might.
First, the Goldilocks. I have a Goldilocks problem for you.
Yep.
The law of crime, we haven't talked about most people in a much less original way than you have talked about crime versus the law of war. The law of crime looks too restrictive for terrorism. The law of war is interpreted by our government as giving no protections at all, so it looks too open for terrorism. Is your complaint with law, or is it a complaint with those two bodies of law? Do we need a new body of law written by Congress that comes somewhere between crime and war law, somewhere between crime and the law of war? And would you have any objection to that? Because that would be still law, but would it have the dangers you're describing?
Well, first of all, I think it would be a step forward. So I think we had a real opportunity after 9/11 to define the terms on which these new difficult kinds of conflicts would be fought. And it was a moment for real legal and political creativity in which we could have designed a system that was appropriate to these asymmetric conflicts and tried to get the rest of the world to go along with that interpretation. And I think there were a lot of opportunities to try to design a system that was not as restrictive as the domestic criminal system and not as permissive and open as the international system. And in many other areas of the struggle, that's precisely what we did. Inventing new ways of tracking funds, inventing new ways of tracking individuals and dealing with extradition issues. So there have been a variety of areas in which legal creativity has generated a new regime of cooperation that facilitates the struggle against terrorism. But in this area relating to warfare and detainees, we took exactly the opposite tack. Rather than trying to build a system that was attuned to this new kind of circumstance, we pulled back into an approach that was very unilateral and that said we are going to go with the most permissive possible interpretation of the law of war as it exists. So my first answer to the question is yes, we missed an opportunity to build better law that would have been more appropriate to this new kind of warfare. As we did that, and were we to try to do that, I'd want us also to remain attentive to the ways in which, once we have the wonderful system in place, we might lose track of what we're actually doing to people as we apply it, and we might deaden our sense as citizens that we're responsible for an awful lot of pain and suffering in the world as we struggle in the war on terror. And it seems to me there's a larger ethical question about the extent to which one should back up from the idea that the single sine qua non of politics today is fighting the war on terror. Is there some other kind of world that would be some other kind of ethical discussion that would treat extremism and terrorist acts as crimes, downgrade them in some way, as part of the fabric and background fabric of life as we'll be living it for the next while? And I think the opportunity to step back from the demonization of all of these things was also lost, and to think in a new and different ethical way, and I'm not sure any new legal regime could have helped us with that problem.
You lead right to my question, and I wonder, how did the law take over this entire realm? How did law come to be such a dominant force in both politics and consideration of war? Where were the other players? At one point, there was a religious concept of just war. What happened to that concept? And where are the other parties you see might come to the table and help articulate a different ethical or moral basis for understanding violence and the meaning of humanitarian rights?
I think it happened as a result of a kind of unholy alliance, if you like, between the military professionals on the one hand and the religious and humanitarian voices on the other. As the military became a more professionalized operation and a larger bureaucracy, and became integrated with civilian life more and more in more complicated ways, and pursued warfare across many more jurisdictions in more complicated ways, they were searching for modes of disciplining troops and understanding what they're doing and communicating their political objective, and they turned to law to do that at a time when law itself was becoming flexible, was becoming more open, relying more on broad standards like proportionality. From the other side, there came the humanitarians who saw an opportunity to try to get inside the professionalization of the military and turn their concerns about just war into legal standards. So take the UN Charter. Drafted in very broad strokes, just like any constitution, it says you're not allowed to use force except as provided for in the Charter. And there was regarded as a dramatic leap forward by many of the institutions that one might have thought would be bringing and continuing to bring an independent ethical voice to things. But like most constitutions, the Charter's drafted in very broad terms. There are lots of exceptions. There's no final interpreter, as a gentleman earlier pointed out. And there's almost no war that you could imagine fighting that couldn't in one or another way be justified under the Charter. There's always something to say. It really was our territory. They attacked us first. They're not really a state. It's our self-defense. We're defending the purposes and principles of the United Nations. We're implementing an earlier Security Council resolution. There's almost always something that a party intent on war can say to cast their cause in just terms. And so I think the alliance between humanitarian voices and military professional voices has deprived us of the opportunity to think in a new way about when violence really ought to be treated as justified and when killing really is and should be privileged.
Would it be fair to characterize what you've just said as saying that international law has simply provided a vocabulary to justify what would have happened anyway, i.e. what was militarily expedient? Or do you think that international law has actually been a force for good at some point or another?
I think it's a very mixed case. So my sense is that certainly in terms of the intention of the people, it was people with the very best intention of limiting warfare in a variety of ways who pursued the strategy of legalization. So I wouldn't want to suggest for a moment that there was anything cynical about the effort. The effort was to try to develop a very broad international vocabulary for judging the legitimacy of political activity. And that is an accomplishment, and it could be used in ways that might be very effective and awaken our sense of moral responsibility. So in terms of intention, it was not the intention to develop a vocabulary that would justify any kind of warfare. There's a question of how then it gets used and how that evolves over time, and I think we need to remember the extent to which the UN Charter has been used to make a lot of violence seem quite legitimate. But that doesn't suggest to me that all that would have happened exactly the same way anyway. Because one of the things that's very interesting is people feel they're entitled to engage in warfare they might not otherwise have thought they were entitled to engage in. They learn what their prerogatives are and what they should worry about, what they should be upset about, also from legal terminology and from the UN Charter. So I think that it's shaped the politics of warfare, and it's shaped what states understand to be the reasons for going to war. Sometimes that has prevented certain kinds of battles from being legitimate. Sometimes it's made others that might not have been fought at all seem quite legitimate. So it's been a potent force in shaping our political life. It hasn't been a force that's been wholly innocent of participating in justifying violence.
Thank you, David Kennedy.
Thank you very much.
Very instructive and interesting talk.